Enter the mysteries of Mount Washington as we uncover 5 strange deaths that defy explanation. Each story holds its own puzzle, leaving us wondering what really happened. From people disappearing mysteriously to strange accidents, these events make us question what we know. Let's explore together and see what we can uncover. In the cold of January 1982, Joe Lentini got a call. It was late, so he knew it meant trouble. 2 climbers were lost up on Mount Washington, caught in the freezing grip of winter. It was dangerous up there, with the wind howling and the temperatures plummeting. Lentini wasn't alone in answering the call. He was part of a team, a group of folks who volunteered for the Mountain Rescue Service. They were the ones who went out when others were in trouble, risking their own safety to save lives. Albert Dow III was among them. He was no stranger to the mountain. He was a skilled climber with a heart of gold. When Lentini and his team set out in the early morning hours, Dow was right there with them, ready to lend a hand. The journey up the mountain was tough. The wind cut through their clothes like knives, and the snow made every step a struggle. But Lentini and his team were determined. They knew lives were on the line, and they wouldn't rest until they found those lost climbers. As they climbed higher and higher, the air grew colder and the wind grew stronger. It was like nothing Lentini had ever experienced before, a relentless force that seemed determined to push them back down the mountain. But they pressed on, following the faint trail left by the lost climbers. It wasn't easy, navigating the rough land and battling the elements, but they refused to give up, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to help those in need. Then, just when they thought they were making progress, disaster struck. A fierce and sudden avalanche swept down the mountainside, burying Albert Dow beneath tons of snow and ice. Lentini and his team sprang into action, digging frantically in hopes of finding their companion alive. But as the minutes ticked by, their hopes began to fade. Dow was gone, lost to the mountain he loved so much. It was a devastating blow, not just to Lentini and his team, but to the entire community. Dow was a hero, a man who had given his life trying to save others. His loss was felt by all who knew him, an example of the dangers that go with exploring through the mountains. But even in their grief, Lentini and his team refused to give up. They continued their search, scouring every inch of the mountain in hopes of finding the lost climbers. It was a grueling task, made all the more difficult by the harsh conditions and the weight of their loss. Days passed and still there was no sign of the missing climbers. Lentini and his team were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but they pressed on, driven by a determination to bring closure to the families of those lost on the mountain. And then, finally, a step forward, a set of tracks, faint but still visible, leading them to a remote corner of the mountain. Lentini and his team followed the tracks, their hearts pounding with anticipation. But as they reached the end of the trail, they were met with silence. The climbers were nowhere to be found, their fate a mystery that would haunt Lentini and his team for years to come. In the end, Lentini and his team were forced to accept defeat. The mountain had claimed its victims, and there was nothing more they could do. But they vowed to never forget those lost on that tragic day. As Lentini looked over the snow-covered landscape, he couldn't help but wonder, what if they had turned back sooner? What if they had listened to the warnings and stayed off the mountain? It was a question that would never be answered, lost amidst the howling wind and the icy silence of Mount Washington. It was a chilly morning on February 1st, 2021, when Ian Forgaze, a backcountry skier from Lincoln, Vermont, went on what would tragically be his final adventure. Known affectionately as Skiin' Ian or Lincoln Lynx, Forgaze was a familiar figure in the rough lands of the White Mountains, where his love for skiing and the great outdoors knew no bounds. Forgaze was not your typical skier. He eschewed the crowded slopes of ski resorts in favor of the wilderness, where he could carve his own path through pristine powder. He was a legend among his peers, known for his fearless spirit and unbreakable passion for the mountains. On that tragic day, Forgay set his sights on Ammonoosuc Ravine, a remote and challenging area on the western side of Mount Washington. Despite the bitter cold and the looming threat of avalanches, he was undeterred, driven by a desire to conquer new peaks and push the limits of his abilities. The weather looked good, with clear skies and temperatures just below freezing. The Mount Washington Avalanche Center had given a low danger rating for avalanches, making skiers like Forgay's feel more safe than they might actually have been. Equipped with all the necessary gear, an avalanche transceiver, probe, crampons, shovel, and an ice axe, Forgay set out on his journey, his heart pounding with excitement. Little did he know that danger lurked just beneath the surface of the pristine snow. As he ascended the slopes of Mount Washington, Forgay gazed upon the breathtaking beauty of the landscape. It was a scene straight out of a postcard, a product of nature that no amount of manpower can create. But despite the peace lying within the mountains, danger still presented itself subtly in the form of hidden pockets of unstable snow. As Forgay traversed the treacherous terrain, he unwittingly entered one of these dangerous areas, triggering a small avalanche that sent him tumbling down the mountainside. For hours, Forgay lay buried beneath the icy debris, his cries for help drowned out by the howling wind. Meanwhile, friends and fellow skiers grew increasingly concerned when he failed to return home or answer their calls. It wasn't until late Tuesday night that the alarm was raised and a frantic search and rescue operation was launched. Despite the late hour and the challenging conditions, teams from the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department, the White Mountain National Forest, and the all-volunteer Mountain Rescue Service sprang into action, determined to find their missing comrade. The search was a race against time, as rescuers combed through the snow-covered landscape in search of any sign of Forgay. Using advanced equipment and techniques, they scanned the mountainside for his avalanche transceiver signal, praying for a miracle amidst the cold and darkness. Finally, at approximately 4:30 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon, a beacon signal was detected, pinpointing Forgay's location beneath the avalanche debris. With renewed determination, the rescue team set to work, digging tirelessly through layers of snow in a desperate bid to reach him. Hour after hour, they toiled in the biting cold, their hands numb and their breath hanging in the frosty air. At long last, after more than an hour and a half of digging, they uncovered Forgay's lifeless body, buried beneath almost 13 feet of snow. The news shocked the backcountry community as friends and fellow skiers mourned the loss of one of their own. Forgay's death is a reminder of the dangers inherent in going into the wild places we hold dear. As we reflect on this tragic loss, questions linger in our minds. What if Forgay had chosen a different route? What if he had heeded the warnings of the unstable snowpack? What if he had not gone into the backcountry alone? In the wake of this heartbreaking incident, we are reminded of life's uncertainty and the need for caution when venturing into potentially dangerous places. Ian Forgay may have left this world, but his spirit lives on in the memories of those who knew and loved him. As we mourn his loss, we're reminded to cherish each moment and tread carefully in the wild places we call home. On a chilly afternoon in March 2024, Madison Salzberg, a spirited 20-year-old who adored skiing and the great outdoors, went on a thrilling adventure with two close friends to Mount Washington, New Hampshire. Madison, with her infectious laughter and boundless energy, was always up for an adventure, especially when it involved tackling the rugged slopes of Tuckerman Ravine. The trio set out with excitement bubbling in their veins, their laughter echoing through the crisp mountain air as they made their way up the slopes. Madison in particular couldn't contain her enthusiasm, her eyes sparkling with anticipation as they approached the ravine. As they went deeper into the ravine, the conditions became increasingly challenging. The snow was hard and icy, making it difficult to maintain their balance as they navigated the steep slopes. Despite the treacherous terrain, Madison's adventurous spirit remained undeterred, her determination to explore the mountain shining through with every step. But then disaster struck. Madison, caught off guard by a particularly icy patch, lost her footing and tumbled down the slope, disappearing from view in a matter of seconds. Her friends, stunned by the sudden turn of events, frantically searched for any sign of her amidst the snow and rocks, but she seemed to have vanished without a trace. As panic set in, Madison's friends immediately called for help, alerting emergency services to the situation. Rescue teams quickly sprang into action, deploying helicopters and search parties to scour the mountain in search of Madison. Despite their efforts, however, she remained elusive, leaving her friends and family to endure an agonizing wait for news of her fate. In the days that followed, the mountain was alive with the sound of search helicopters and the shouts of rescue workers, determined as they combed the terrain for any sign of Madison. Despite their efforts, however, she remained missing, leaving her loved ones to grapple with the terrifying uncertainty of what had really happened to her. As the search stretched on, theories began to emerge about what might have happened to Madison. Some speculated that she may have become disoriented in the harsh conditions, while others feared that she may have suffered serious injuries in her fall. Could she have avoided the tragic events that ultimately led to her disappearance? And what if the search teams had been able to find her before it was too late? Could they have saved her from the icy grip of the mountain, bringing her back safely to her loved ones and sparing them the pain of her loss? The search continued, and the echoes of unanswered questions seemed to stretch on into infinity, leaving a haunting sense of uncertainty in their wake. But amidst the fear and despair, one thing remained certain. Madison Salzberg, with her adventurous spirit and enthusiasm for new adventures in life, would be dearly missed by all who knew her. In the warm summer of 2021, Brian Roback, a cheerful 28-year-old from Hillsboro, Oregon, went into the majestic heights of Mount Washington for what he thought would be another exciting climb. Brian was no stranger to adventure. He loved the thrill of exploring mountains and the great outdoors. Working as a contractor at the Big Lake Youth Camp, he spent most of his summers surrounded by nature, soaking in the beauty of the wilderness. On June 30th, Brian set out on a solo hike, his backpack loaded with essentials and his heart filled with anticipation. He left his car parked at the youth camp and headed toward the towering peak of Mount Washington. As he trudged along the rough trails, he couldn't help but wonder at the stunning scenery around him. The sun beat down on his back, warming his skin as he climbed higher and higher. Brian was no novice when it came to mountain climbing. With 8 summers of experience at the youth camp, he felt confident in his abilities. He greeted fellow climbers with a friendly nod as he passed them on the trail, exchanging stories and sharing laughs along the way. The camaraderie of the mountain was something Brian cherished, an example of the connections we forge when we step outside of our comfort zones. As the hours passed, Brian pushed himself to reach the summit before nightfall. He knew the dangers of climbing in the dark, especially on a mountain as unforgiving as Mount Washington. With each step, he felt a surge of adrenaline, his determination pushing him forward towards his goal. Finally, after hours of hiking, Brian reached the summit of Mount Washington. The view from the top was breathtaking, a panorama of rugged peaks and rolling hills stretching out before him. He snapped a few photos to capture the moment, a proud smile on his face as he took in the beauty of the world below. But as Brian began his descent, tragedy struck. The loose, rocky terrain proved treacherous, causing him to lose his footing and tumble down the mountainside. He tried to grab onto anything he could to stop his fall, but it was no use. He plummeted down, 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 until he finally came to rest on the rocky ground below. News of Brian's disappearance spread quickly, sending shockwaves through the tight-knit community of climbers and outdoor enthusiasts. Search and rescue teams sprang into action, scouring the mountain for any sign of the missing hiker. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness as they combed the terrain below. For days, the search continued, with volunteers and officials alike refusing to give up hope. They combed every inch of the mountain, following every lead and clinging to the belief that Brian would be found alive and well. However, as the days passed with no sign of him, their optimism began to fade. Despite their best efforts, Brian remained missing, his fate a tragic mystery that haunted those who knew him. Theories began to emerge about what may have happened to him, ranging from simple accidents to more sinister explanations. But without any concrete evidence, the truth remained a mystery. As the weeks stretched into months, Brian's family and friends grappled with the heartbreaking reality of his disappearance. They held on to memories of happier times, cherishing the moments they had shared with him and praying for his safe return. But as time went on, their hopes dwindled, replaced by a sense of loss and grief. In the end, Brian's disappearance is a reminder of the dangers of exploring the wilderness. And though Brian may be gone, his memories and enthusiasm live on in the hearts of those who knew him. What if Brian had chosen a different path? What if he had taken extra precautions before embarking on his climb? Unfortunately, these questions may never be answered. Norman Prebatch, a 67-year-old from Massachusetts, loved nothing more than exploring the great outdoors. He was an experienced hiker, always up for an adventure, especially when it involved scaling the rough slopes of Mount Washington. On April 1, 2012, Norman set out on what he thought would be another exhilarating hike with his son Seth and a group of friends. The day started like any other, with excitement in the air and the promise of new trails to explore. The sun was shining, but there was a chill in the air that hinted at the challenges to come. Norman, ever the optimist, brushed aside any concerns, eager to tackle the mountain he knew so well. As they made their way up the mountain, the weather took a turn for the worse. Dark clouds loomed overhead, and the wind whipped fiercely against their faces. Seth suggested they turn back, but Norman, confident in his abilities, assured him they could press on. But then, disaster struck. Norman, navigating a particularly icy patch of terrain, lost his footing and tumbled down the slope. Seth watched in horror as his father disappeared from view, swallowed by the unforgiving landscape. Frantic shouts echoed through the ravine as Seth and his friends rushed to Norman's aid, searching desperately for any sign of him. Unfortunately, they found none. Rescue teams were called in, their expertise and equipment offering hope in the face of overwhelming despair. But as they descended into the crevasse where Norman had fallen, they were met with a scene of chaos and danger. Hanging ice threatened to collapse at any moment, and the snow beneath their feet was treacherously unstable. Visibility was poor, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. However, they still pressed on, driven by a determination to bring Norman home. Hours turned into days, and there was still no sign of Norman. Seth refused to give up hope, clinging to the belief that his father was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. But as the days eventually turned into weeks, reality began to sink in. The mountain had claimed Norman as its own, swallowing him whole and leaving behind only memories of a life cut tragically short. Seth struggled to come to terms with his loss, grappling with the pain of losing not just a father, but a mentor and a friend. In the years that followed, Seth returned to Mount Washington time and time again, searching for closure in the place where his father had met his end. As Seth looked out over the landscape, he couldn't help but wonder what might have been. What if they had turned back when Seth first suggested it? What if Norman had taken a different path up the mountain? The questions plagued him, haunting his every step as he wandered the slopes in search of answers. But in the end, there were no easy answers, no neat explanations to make sense of Norman's untimely demise. All Seth could do was carry on, his father's memory forever etched in the fabric of his being.